The rhythmic thrum of the drums vibrated through the stone floor of the grand hall, a heartbeat of anticipation that only heightened Patricia's terror. Pinned into a cold, damp alcove behind a massive pillar, she felt the rough stone biting into her back as her stepmother leaned in, eyes flashing with a warning sharper than any blade. "Stay in the shadows, you pathetic wretch," the woman hissed, her fingers digging into Patricia's shoulders as she adjusted her own daughter's shimmering silks in the golden light just beyond the pillar. Patricia clutched her tattered brown rags around her, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She was a defect, an omega with no wolf spirit, hidden away so her shame wouldn't taint the family's chance at a crown. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and the atmosphere shifted from hopeful chatter to a suffocating, reverent silence. King Warner entered, a towering figure of dark authority clad in black leather armor and a mantle of silver-gray wolf fur that seemed to swallow the light of the chandeliers. He walked with the predatory grace of an alpha who had spent 10 years searching the territories for a soul that could match his own. Patricia watched through a crack in the masonry, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, to escape the cruelty of her life. Yet she felt a strange magnetic pull toward the king that defied her crippling self-hatred. As Warner reached the center of the hall, he ignored the line of perfumed noblewomen preening for his attention. His head snapped toward the shadows, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that cut through the lilies and incense. The court gasped as the Alpha King turned his back on the elite and marched toward the dark corner of the room. Patricia's breath hitched as he stopped directly before her hiding spot, his golden amber eyes piercing the gloom to lock onto her brunette curls and trembling form. In that moment, the power radiating from him felt not like a threat, but like a beacon. Warner reached into the darkness, his large hand wrapping gently yet possessively around her arm as he pulled her out into the light, declaring to the stunned silence of the room that the ceremony was over and he had finally found his queen. The transition from the shadowed alcove to the center of the ballroom felt like a plunge into freezing water. Patricia stood shivering in her tattered rags, the rough fabric a jagged scar against the sea of silk and velvet that surrounded her. The opulent chandeliers above seemed to burn brighter, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on her matted hair and the dirt beneath her fingernails. A ripple of scandalized murmurs rose from the noblewomen, their faces twisting into masks of derision as they looked upon the girl their king had chosen over them. Her stepmother stood frozen near the pillar, her face draining of color as the shameful secret she had spent years burying was suddenly thrust into the royal spotlight. King Warner did not flinch at the collective gasp of his subjects. He remained a mountain of black iron and silver fur, his presence so vast it seemed to push the very air out of the room. His hand remained anchored to Patricia's arm, not with the bruising force of her stepmother, but with a terrifying, absolute heat that made her skin prickle. She looked up at him, her brunette eyes wide with a mixture of awe and the reflexive urge to flee. She was an omega with no wolf, a defect meant for the cellar, yet this man looked at her as if she were the only living thing in the hall. "You are hurt," Warner murmured, his voice a low rumble that only she could hear, his eyes narrowing as he took in the faint red marks her stepmother's grip had left on her skin. Patricia tried to shrink back, her old habits of invisibility screaming for her to hide, but the king stepped closer, effectively shielding her from the hostile glares of the court. The visual contrast was absolute, the magnificent Alpha King in his regal armor protecting a girl who looked like she had been plucked from the ruins of a fire. Ignoring the protests of the high-ranking elders who began to step forward with frantic excuses, Warner reached down. With a single, effortless motion, he swept Patricia off her feet and into his arms. The tattered hem of her brown dress fluttered against his polished greaves as he turned toward the exit. He didn't offer an explanation or wait for a blessing. He simply began to walk, his stride heavy and purposeful, carrying his broken prize out of the house of her tormentors and toward a future she had never dared to imagine. The heavy oak doors of the Northern Pine Lodge slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a final gavel strike on Patricia's old life. King Warner didn't stop until they reached the edge of the pack's sacred territory, where the moonlight hit the snow in a blinding sheet of silver. A crowd of pack members had spilled out from the hall, trailing at a distance, their faces a blur of shock and indignation. Warner finally set Patricia down at the very boundary of the forest, but he did not release her hand. He turned back to the gathered wolves, his gaze sweeping over them with the frigid lethality of a winter storm. "By the ancient laws of the first moon," Warner's voice boomed, vibrating through the trees and making the birds take flight in a panicked rush. "I claim this woman. She is no longer of your blood, no longer subject to your laws, and no longer bound by your cruelty." He reached out, his thumb tracing the jawline of Patricia's tear-stained face, forcing her to look up. "She is the Alpha King's chosen. To touch her is to touch me. To insult her is to invite the wrath of the Blackthorn throne." A low, collective murmur of protest rose from the elders, but it died instantly when Warner let out a warning growl that shook the very earth beneath their feet. He reached into the folds of his fur mantle and pulled out a heavy, dark iron signet ring, pressing it into Patricia's palm. The metal was warm from his skin, a physical weight that anchored her to a reality she still couldn't grasp. "Close your hand," he commanded gently. As she obeyed, she felt a strange electric spark travel from the ring up her arm, a flicker of something deep inside her that she had been told was dead. With a final dismissive glance at the stepmother who watched from the porch with narrowed, hateful eyes, Warner led Patricia toward his waiting obsidian black carriage. The royal guards snapped to attention, their silver armor clashing as they bowed in perfect unison to the girl in rags. As the carriage door closed, sealing out the cold and the judgmental whispers of her past, Patricia realized the transition was absolute. She wasn't just leaving a house. She was being abducted by destiny. The wheels began to churn against the frozen earth, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known toward a capital that would either crown her or consume her. The journey to the capital lasted 3 days, a blur of changing landscapes that Patricia watched through the carriage's velvet curtains, but the arrival at the mountain fortress of Blackthorn City was what truly stole her breath. The royal residence was a staggering monolith of dark stone and glass, perched like a crown upon the jagged peaks. As the carriage came to a halt, the massive doors carved with the image of a howling wolf swung inward, revealing an interior of intimidating elegance. Patricia stepped onto the polished marble, her bare feet feeling the chill of the stone, while her tattered brown rags felt like a stain against the pristine blue and silver decor of the foyer. The hospitality she expected as a queen was nowhere to be found among the palace staff. While King Warner was immediately pulled away by a flurry of urgent advisors and generals, Patricia was left in the care of cold-eyed servants who looked at her with thinly veiled disgust. "The king's tastes have certainly become rustic," one maid whispered loudly enough for the sound to echo off the vaulted ceilings. They ushered her toward the royal bath, their movements efficient but devoid of the warmth she had briefly felt from Warner. Left alone in a bathroom with a sunken tub filled with scented waters, Patricia caught her reflection in a full-length mirror for the first time in years. She looked fragile, her brunette hair tangled and her eyes shadowed by the trauma of her upbringing. The opulence surrounding her, the silk sheets, the fine soaps, and the intricate gowns laid out on the bed felt like a golden cage designed to highlight her inadequacies. Every fine thread of the pale blue dress waiting for her seemed to mock the Omega who had been told she was a defect with no wolf spirit. As night fell, the isolation of the vast suite began to press in on her. The silence of the fortress far more terrifying than the noise of the pack house. She traced the heavy iron signet ring Warner had given her, the only thing that felt real in this world of thorns and silk. She was an unknown element in a den of predators, a girl in a crown she didn't believe she deserved, waiting for a king who had claimed her for reasons she still couldn't fathom. The flickering candlelight in the small dining hall cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls as King Warner finally joined Patricia for their first private meal. He had traded his heavy battle armor for a tunic of deep charcoal, looking less like a distant god and more like a man burdened by the very crown he wore. Patricia sat stiffly in her new silk gown, the fine fabric feeling like a foreign skin, her fingers nervously twisting the iron signet ring. She looked down at the untouched food, the silence between them heavy with the questions she had been too afraid to ask. "You look as though you are waiting for the guards to drag you back to the cellar," Warner said, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the small table. He didn't sound angry, only weary. Patricia finally found the courage to meet his amber gaze, seeing the fatigue etched into the lines of his face. "I don't understand why I'm here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am an omega who cannot shift. I am a defect in a world that only values strength. You could have had any of those noble women, yet you chose a girl who is nothing." Warner set down his wine, his expression hardening, though not at her. "Strength is a blunt instrument, Patricia. I've spent my life surrounded by it. Wolves who can tear throats but cannot lead, who have power but no light." He leaned forward, the intensity of his presence warming the air. "I didn't choose you because of your rank or your ability to grow claws. I chose you because when I walked into that hall, I felt something I haven't felt in a decade. A warmth, a clarity." He reached across the table, his large hand hovering near hers before he pulled back, as if afraid his own darkness might snuff her out. "The world sees a defect," he continued, his voice dropping to a vulnerable rasp. "But I see a balance. I am a king of shadows and blood, Patricia. I have built this empire on fear because it was the only language the territories understood." He looked at his own hands, scarred from years of war. "But fear cannot sustain a kingdom forever. I sensed a light in you, a dormant power that I lack. I didn't claim you to be a trophy. I claimed you because I think you are the only one who can keep me from becoming the monster everyone already believes I am." For the first time, Patricia didn't see a predator. She saw a man searching for a reason to be more than a conqueror, and the nothing inside her began to stir with the first faint embers of a purpose. The stillness of the mountain fortress was broken not by sound, but by a hum that resonated deep within Patricia's bones. In the days following her conversation with Warner, the palace felt less like a prison and more like a sounding board for a voice she couldn't yet hear. Drawn by a restless energy, she began to wander the high-terraced gardens where the mountain air was thin and biting. The servants gave her a wide berth, their whispers silenced by the predatory presence of the guards Warner had assigned to her, yet their hostility still reached her like a cold draft. It was during one of these solitary walks, as the moon hung heavy and silver over the peaks, that the nothingness inside her finally fractured. As she neared a grove of ancient, gnarled pines, the forest seemed to lean toward her, the needles rustling with a collective sigh that sounded suspiciously like a name. She pressed her hand against a frost-covered trunk, and instead of the bite of ice, she felt a pulse, a rhythmic, golden vibration that mirrored the heartbeat of the mountain itself. It wasn't the aggressive, carnal heat of a wolf's shift. It was something vast, ancient, and cool, like starlight caught in a vessel. The whispers grew into distinct calls, echoing not in her ears but in the spaces between her thoughts. She saw flashes of images that didn't belong to her, a circle of women draped in white, their hands raised to a sun that never set, and a sky filled with constellations that moved like living creatures. Panic flared in her chest, the familiar terror of being wrong. But as she clutched Warner's signet ring, the iron grew searingly hot, anchoring her to the present. She realized then that the stepmother's taunts had been a lie designed to keep her small. Her wolf wasn't missing or broken. It had been suppressed because it was something much more powerful than a physical predator. She was a celestial, a conduit for a light that the world had forgotten. As she stood in the center of the grove, a faint, ethereal glow began to emanate from her skin, casting long, otherworldly shadows across the snow. The birds in the trees didn't fly away. They settled, watching her with knowing eyes. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She wasn't a defective omega meant to be hidden. She was a beacon, and the king hadn't just found a mate. He had found the lost key to his kingdom's survival. The heavy iron gates of the fortress groaned open to admit a carriage bearing the crest of the northern pine, and with it, the very poison Patricia had hoped to leave behind. Her stepmother, Vivian, stepped onto the palace cobblestones not with the iron-fisted rage she had shown in the cellar, but with a mask of weeping contrition that chilled Patricia to the bone. Cloaked in mourning black, the woman fell to her knees before King Warner, claiming her previous cruelty was merely a misguided attempt to protect the crown from a girl she believed was too fragile for the throne. It was a performance of such practiced humility that even the palace guards seemed to soften. Warner, wary but bound by the protocols of blood ties, allowed Vivian to remain in the guest wing for the duration of the pre-coronation festivities. "Keep your friends close, and your enemies where you can see them," he murmured to Patricia in the hallway, his hand resting supportively on the small of her back. But Patricia could feel the truth through her awakening senses. Vivian's aura wasn't repentant. It was a jagged, murky gray, swirling with the intent of a scavenger waiting for a kill. The stepmother wasn't there to apologize. She was a scout for the king's political rivals, sent to find the defect and exploit it before the bond could be finalized. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, Vivian sought Patricia out in the royal solarium. Her voice was a honeyed venom as she offered a silver chalice filled with a rare, sweet-smelling tea. "A peace offering, daughter," Vivian whispered, her eyes tracking Patricia's every move with predatory focus. "To settle your nerves before the gala tonight. You look so radiant. It would be a shame if that light were to burn out too soon." Patricia stared at the liquid, the golden vibration in her blood recoiling from the cup. She could sense the acrid tang of wolfsbane and something darker, a sedative meant to dampen the spirit. Patricia set the cup aside, her hands steady despite the phantom echoes of her childhood fears. "I am not the girl you locked in the corner, Vivian," she said, her voice carrying a new, resonant authority. The stepmother's mask slipped for a fleeting second, revealing a snarl of pure hatred before she smoothed her features back into a smile. As Vivian retreated, Patricia realized the stage was set. The accident her stepmother was plotting wouldn't happen in the shadows. It would happen tonight, at the royal gala, where the stakes were the highest and the audience was the largest. Patricia touched the iron ring on her finger, knowing that tonight she would either shine or be snuffed out forever. The royal gala was a kaleidoscope of spinning silks and shimmering jewelry, but beneath the music, Patricia could feel a discordant pulse of encroaching violence. King Warner stood at the head of the ballroom, a formidable shadow in his dark armor, yet Patricia noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his glass. The wolfsbane Vivian had slipped into the royal wine was working, a silent poison designed to paralyze the king's internal wolf and leave him defenseless against the blade. As the clock struck midnight, the heavy doors burst open, and a coordinated strike of insurgents, led by the Northern Pines elite, flooded the hall with bared steel. Warner tried to shift, his muscles rippling in a painful, staggered rhythm, but the poison held his beast in a chokehold, leaving him to collapse to one knee as the first assassin lunged. "Now!" Vivian screamed from the balcony, her face twisted in a mask of triumphant malice. Patricia felt the old paralyzing fear clawing at her throat. But then she looked at Warner, the man who had seen light in her when she saw only a defect. And the self-hatred finally shattered. The nothingness in her chest didn't just break. It exploded. A pillar of pure, white-hot celestial energy erupted from Patricia's core, a blinding starlight that turned the ballroom as bright as high noon. The assassins were thrown back by a physical wave of power, their weapons clattering to the marble floor as they shielded their eyes from the divine radiance. Patricia stepped forward, no longer a trembling Omega in rags, but a celestial being draped in a shimmering aura that pulsed with the heartbeat of the moon. With a single gesture, she channeled her light into Warner, the celestial energy burning through the wolfsbane in his veins and igniting his power with an intensity he had never known. The king rose, his amber eyes glowing with a reflected golden fire, as he realized Patricia wasn't just his mate, but his salvation. Together, they stood at the center of the chaos, the alpha of shadows and the queen of light, as the insurgents realized too late that the shameful secret they had come to destroy was the very power that would bring them to their knees. The golden light of the gala transitioned into the soft, steady glow of a new dawn as the palace was finally purged of its traitors. King Warner stood on the high balcony overlooking the mountain city, his hand interlaced with Patricia's, their shared bond vibrating with a resonance that felt like a permanent hum of electricity. Below them, the remnants of the insurgency were being led away in chains, while Vivian, stripped of her titles and finery, was cast out of the kingdom to wander the waste she had once threatened to send Patricia to. The official coronation was not a display of brute force, but a ceremony of profound spiritual renewal. As the crown was placed upon Patricia's head, her celestial aura didn't flare with the violent intensity of the battle, but settled into a gentle, protective shimmer that seemed to touch every wolf in the capital. She was no longer the defective girl hidden in the shadows of a packhouse. She was the living heart of a new dynasty. The self-hatred that had once defined her had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence in her purpose as the kingdom's beacon. Warner turned to her, the legendary ruthlessness in his eyes replaced by a fierce, devoted pride. "You were never a defect, Patricia," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive rumble that carried across the quieted crowds. "You were the piece of my soul I didn't know was missing." Together, they looked out over the 5 territories, a kingdom no longer held together solely by fear, but by the balance of Warner's shadow and Patricia's light. The era of the hidden star had ended, and the reign of the celestial queen had begun. The seasons turned, yet the warmth that had settled over the Blackthorn Mountain fortress remained constant. Patricia stood in the royal gardens, no longer a girl who flinched at her own shadow, but a woman who walked with the poise of an ancient constellation. Beside her, the saplings she had tended with her starlight power grew with an unnatural, vibrant health, their leaves shimmering with a faint golden hue that whispered of the peace now blanketing the 5 territories. The heavy iron signet ring was now joined by a band of celestial silver, a physical anchor to the man who had seen her worth when she was nothing but a secret in a cellar. Warner joined her, his presence no longer a crushing weight of shadows but a secure harbor. He pulled her back against his chest, his hands resting over hers, marveling at the pulse of energy that moved between them, a bridge of light and dark that had redefined the very meaning of an Alpha King's rule. "The elders from the Northern Pine sent a courier today," he murmured into her hair, his voice devoid of its old weary edge. "They seek your guidance on a dispute. They no longer fear your light. They rely on it." Patricia smiled, looking out toward the horizon where the sun and moon seemed to share the sky for a fleeting, magical moment. The trauma of her past hadn't vanished, but it had been transformed into the foundation of her empathy, allowing her to sense and elevate the hidden defects in others across the kingdom. She was the proof that the moon did not make mistakes, only mysteries that required the right heart to solve. I was hidden for so long, she whispered, leaning back into Warner's strength, that I forgot stars are only invisible when the sun is too loud. Warner turned her in his arms, his amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of her skin, and kissed her with a tenderness that sealed their eternal vow. They were more than a king and queen. They were a new dawn, ensuring that in their kingdom, no soul would ever be forced into a corner of shadows again. If you enjoyed the journey of Patricia's transformation from a hidden Omega to a radiant celestial queen, don't let the story end here. Show your support for this tale of starlight and shadows. Like this story if you loved seeing the underdog finally take her throne. Comment below with your favorite moment. Was it the king's dramatic claim or Patricia's celestial awakening? Subscribe to stay updated on new chapters and future stories where the hidden are finally found.